August 1942. Jungle of Guadalcanal. Major General Kawaguchi, a veteran of campaigns in China, was watching his surroundings with confidence. His men had trained for years for hand-to-hand combat. At night, the American enemy would become only a figure and bayonet. None of his officers considered that the adversary, buried in the mud, could respond with something as vulgar as a shotgun. That short, heavy hunting gun, good for rabbits perhaps, not for modern warfare. This belief, repeated, indoctrinated, consolidated, would be violently disproved in the humid forests of the Pacific, because there, where the combat took place less than 30 meters away, American industrial logic had fielded an instrument that Japan did not even bother to study. The American 12-gauge was not elegant, but it was brutal, noisy, unexpected. This is the account of a doctrinal error, how the Japanese infantry, trained to win with honor and blade, were surprised by the bang of a weapon that should not have been there, a weapon that the manuals did not foresee, but one that the soldiers would never forget. Because in that jungle, the Japanese silence was broken not by tanks, but by a short, thick, deafening shot. But before we dive into the data, there's one statistic that defines this story, and one that rarely appears in books. During World War II, the United States distributed more than 100,000 12-gauge shotguns among its armed forces. In the Pacific, these weapons were shipped to islands where visibility did not exceed 30 meters, and where, according to Japanese manuals, combat would be won with bayonet, courage, and silence. No Japanese tactical document mentions the possibility of facing a shotgun. No teacher, no doctrine, no prediction. It was such a big absence that it became a strategic blind spot. And yet, even forgotten by reports and scorned by official statistics, this weapon made an impact that will be detailed here, in every muffled noise, in every ambush in the jungle. If you value historical accuracy and the technical reconstruction of forgotten facts, please consider supporting this work. Leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and share this video. Because understanding what was ignored is to understand why so many battles were lost even before the first shot. In 1942, the Imperial Japanese Army believed with unshakable doctrinal conviction that the human spirit was the ultimate weapon. This belief was not rhetorical. It was structure. It was taught in the training camps, recorded in the manuals, and reinforced in military rituals. The Japanese soldier was shaped to win with courage, silence, and blade. The bayonet was not just an instrument, it was a national symbol, an extension of the soul and honor. While the Americans expanded their industrial chain with automatic weapons, flamethrowers, and specialized ammunition, Japan taught its men to move forward with the same formation and weapon as the previous century. The official doctrine held that victory would not come from technology, but from the denial of inner weakness. In the words of General Humma, "If the spirit is strong, steel will be irrelevant." This extreme philosophy led to the systematic neglect of certain armaments, which were deemed unnecessary or undignified. The 12-gauge shotgun, for example, has never been studied, mentioned, or even considered. It belonged to the realm of hunting, not war. A technical error, but above all a moral error. During the 1930s, as Western powers transformed their arsenals based on the experience of World War I, Japan invested in techniques of night infiltration, hand-to-hand combat, and glorification of death in attack. The 1938 Infantry Manual described the optimal use of the bayonet with phrases such as, "Offensive spirit must be cultivated above firing efficiency." It was war as liturgy, and the soldier as offering. In contrast, the U.S. Marine Corps began to incorporate specialized weapons for each scenario: phosphorus grenades for trenches, flamethrowers for caves, shotguns for ambushes at close range. Japan has not only ignored these possibilities, it has openly despised them. And this contempt, transformed into doctrinal absence, would leave fatal gaps in jungle combat. The negligence was visible in the numbers. Between 1942 and 1945, the U.S. produced more than 25,000 units of the Winchester 1897 model and up to 80,000 of the 1912 model, both modified for military combat. None of these weapons appeared in any Japanese defense plan. No studies were done. No tactics were reviewed. No officer thought that short-shot, wide-dispersion weapons would have a tactical role. Meanwhile, Japan produced an average of 70,000 Arisaka rifles a year, models based on a 1905 design. The investment was not in innovation, but in insistence, rigid doctrine, limited production, and a blind faith that the soldier would overcome any weapon with courage. That faith, however, collided with the dry, repeated sound of a shotgun, firing 6 charges of buckshot in 2 seconds. In the dense bush of Guadalcanal, the silent attack lost its element of surprise. The soldier advancing through the night met not distant resistance, but a shower of shells from a single entrenched Marine. Japan, which had hoped to win the war with a code of conduct, stumbled upon a weapon that did not fit its logic. This was not just a technical failure, it was an ideological collapse. A war that depended on faith in the blade could not withstand the unpredictability of a jungle where every bush could contain an ignored weapon. And the irony was just beginning. By 1943, American production of shotgun cartridges exceeded 4 million units. For comparison, Japan did not produce even 10% of that, and it did not even need to, because he never considered this ammunition relevant. That statistic defines the shock. The United States manufactured 10 times as much shotgun ammunition as Japan produced Arisaka rifles that same year. If this surprised you, comment absolute power below, because this numerical difference reveals something bigger. It was not just a conflict of armies, but of worldviews. One vision bet on discipline, the other on the scale. The result was predictable, but only in retrospect. At the time, Japan could not imagine that it would lose not for lack of bravery, but for despising what it did not understand. The shotgun, a tool of farmers and hunters, has become a symbol of a mentality that Japan has failed to foresee or stop. But the data is just the beginning, because in practice, the jungle environment would be in charge of further exposing this doctrinal flaw. And the next part will reveal how the terrain, climate, and humidity of the Pacific sabotaged even the weapon that should have thrown the war off balance. The birth of the American combat rifle did not begin in trenches, but on the workshop benches where John Browning, still at the end of the 19th century, studied the behavior of recoil, the cycle of action, and the possibility of transforming a hunting weapon into an instrument of immediate response. The Model 1897 emerged as a robust mechanical part, with thick steel walls and a bomb action system that allowed the shooter to operate with unusual speed for the time. What made the weapon unique was not just the precise engineering, but the philosophy behind it, a tool made to work when everything around it was failing. Decades later, when the United States transformed its industry into a never-before-seen war gear, the weapon found its way into a production line that combined artisanal methods with modern standardization. Japan never imagined that a rural-looking weapon could be manufactured by the same system that produced bombers and destroyers. Yet that's exactly what happened. The shotgun entered the American arsenal not as exoticism, but as a consequence of an industry capable of manufacturing everything from aero engines to jungle tools. The refinement of the Model 12 further expanded this logic. By adopting internal hammer mechanism, increased drive reliability, and tighter mounting tolerances, the Americans created a weapon that was lighter, smoother, and faster to operate. The slamfire, a feature that allowed the shooter to hold down the trigger while just pumping out the action, turned the shotgun into something no Japanese soldier could have anticipated, a hand-fed, short-range machine gun. The gun could fire 6 buckshot charges in just over 2 seconds, flooding a narrow jungle trail with dozens of shells of more than 8 millimeters each. Japanese doctrine, accustomed to the exchange of bayonets after the initial shock, did not provide that a single rifleman could produce a volume of fire capable of stopping an entire section in the matter of heartbeats. The contrast between philosophy and reality was evident in the field. While Japan bet on the purity of the frontal attack, the United States produced a weapon that nullified any attempt at rapprochement. The militarized rifle gained even greater efficiency with the bayonet of the M1917 model, attached by a reinforced adapter in the shortened barrel. This made it a dual weapon, capable of working for both direct confrontation and surprise combat. Japan trained for the night, for silence, for infiltration. The American shotgun was, ironically, the opposite of all this: noisy, brutal, and aimed at engagements where the enemy approached with measured steps. For the Americans, it filled operational niches ignored by other weapons, especially in forward patrols, perimeter security, and ambush neutralization. For Japan, It represented something impossible to classify. It wasn't a rifle. It wasn't a machine gun. It wasn't a submachine gun. It was an entire category that Japanese doctrine simply had not catalogued. The American differential, however, was not limited to the design. He was in the industry that made it possible to manufacture thousands of niche weapons without compromising the production of the main systems. While Japan struggled to replace lost rifles, the United States assembled shotguns in parallel lines, utilizing skilled labor, automated cutting machines, and strict quality control. The country possessed enough steel to equip an entire additional army and yet maintain a steady flow of secondary weapons. When the Navy and Army requested shotguns adapted for the jungle, the response was not to reorganize production, but only to open another series of contracts. The technical irony was evident. A weapon that Japan despised as a simple farmer's tool was manufactured with the same methods used for elite weapons. In tests conducted in the United States, the Model 12 demonstrated better performance than expected. Rapid fire maintained effective grouping up to 20 yards, and controlled dispersion turned the first shot into an almost guaranteed blow in low-visibility environments. The jungle, unlike the European open field, reduced lines of fire and compressed operational distances. There, every second of volume of fire was decisive. American studies indicated that the rifle required little training to achieve acceptable proficiency, another contrast with Japan, which invested months in the psychological conditioning of the troops for hand-to-hand attack. The American doctrine, based on efficiency, analyzed statistics, tested dispersion patterns, calculated effectiveness per square meter. Japan, stuck in the philosophy of courage, did not register a single line about how to confront such a weapon. The weapon also benefited from logistics. Buckshot ammunition was simple to manufacture, requiring fewer industrial steps than rifle ammunition. Although the war in the Pacific revealed the problems of paper cartridges, at the factory, the pace of production was constant. When the Americans decided to increase stocks, it was enough to redirect part of civilian production. There was no crisis. There was no bottleneck. Japan, constrained by metal reserves and fragile naval transport, could never replicate this kind of adaptation. The American shotgun represented, therefore, more than a weapon. It represented the idea that modern warfare depended on industrial elasticity, and Japan simply did not have this elasticity. The effectiveness of the weapon was not in absolute numbers, but in the deterrent function in restricted environments. The Japanese, who advanced believing he was 3 steps away from victory, found a wall of sound that no manual predicted. In American training, slam fire was taught as an emergency response. If a position was overrun, the shooter was to hold the trigger and pump until the magazine was empty. The result was a flash of fire that filled corridors, trails, and trench entrances with lethal density. The weapon became, for seconds, the manual equivalent of a burst of machine gun fire. This, for the Japanese soldier, meant the collapse of the only pillar that supported his doctrine, the supremacy of the short attack. However, even with this potential, the history of the shotgun in the Pacific took an unexpected turn. The weapon that seemed ideal would face an enemy even more implacable than Japan, the jungle itself. And as the climate began to decide which weapons would live and which would die, the strategic clash deepened in ways that no planner had imagined. The Pacific jungle altered the nature of war so profoundly that no doctrine, neither American nor Japanese, was really prepared for what it would find there. The humidity exceeded levels that would cause wood to rot in days, and the soggy soil turned every step into a risk of jamming. The dense, narrow, and suffocating vegetation reduced visibility to a few meters, creating an environment where conventional strategy was replaced by immediate survival. It was in this territory that the American shotgun, theoretically perfect for close-quarters combat, found both its ideal scenario and its most unexpected threat. The American soldier carrying the Model 97 or Model 12 walked with the impression that he had in his hands a weapon designed for that environment. Wide dispersion, rapid fire, extreme lethality in closed environments. However, the jungle exacted a price that no manual foresaw. Paper cartridges, inherited from decades of civilian use, absorbed moisture with brutal speed. It only took hours of marching, constant splashing, and the suffocating heat for the ammunition to swell and turn into deformed cylinders, unable to be fed into the chamber. In later accounts, some Marines claimed to have had to use bayonets as levers to extract stuck cartridges, while others described futile attempts to dry boxes of ammunition in the sun, only to watch them absorb even more moisture. For Japanese doctrine accustomed to sudden and silent attack, this could have been an advantage. But the irony of the environment was absolute. The same jungle that harmed the American rifle also nullified the weapons that Japan considered nobler. The bayonet, used as an extension of the offensive spirit, lost its usefulness when every movement was impeded by roots, branches, and mud. The infiltration technique, trained with almost ritualistic precision, was sabotaged by insects, unexpected noises, and the smell of decomposing bodies. Silent mobility, preached as a fundamental virtue, became almost impossible when the terrain forced inevitable noises. Japan had devised the perfect night attack, but the jungle turned every approach into a game of chance. While the shotgun suffered from swollen ammunition, the Arisaka rifles faced similar problems: wet powder, accelerated rust, rigid bolts. The weapon that, in the open fields of Manchuria, worked with metallic precision, became a victim of the aggressive biology of the Pacific. The jungle at this point appeared as an impartial arbiter, punishing both Japanese faith in the bayonet and American confidence in the shotgun. Still, the psychological impact of the American gun remained significant. Even when he did not fire, his presence was perceived by the Japanese as an invisible threat, the sound of the action being maneuvered at night. That metallic, short, unmistakable crack spread rumors among units that had marched trusting in the darkness. The Japanese soldier, trained to die with honor, found that courage did not protect him against the volume of instantaneous fire that this weapon could produce when it worked. The shotgun became a symbol of unpredictability, sometimes perfect, sometimes useless, sometimes devastating, sometimes sabotaged by the water that flowed between the leaves. The Americans tried to adapt by improvising solutions. They protected cartridges with rubber covers, stored boxes inside sealed cans, distributed ammunition minutes before the action, hoping that the enemy would not notice the fragility behind the weapon's rugged appearance. And meanwhile, the Japanese continued to advance techniques designed for open fields and dry trenches. The result was an unequal duel between two philosophies in crisis, in the face of an environment that did not respect either of them. The Pacific was, in essence, a battlefield that swallowed up military theories. The American shotgun faced what no factory could have predicted: a climate capable of destroying ammunition before the soldier even had a chance to use it. And yet, for all its flaws, the gun remained the tool that best represented American industrial logic: mass manufacturing, adapting, correcting, insisting. Each failure showed not only the fragility of the weapon, but the strength of an industry capable of testing, modifying, and evolving. Japan, on the other hand, limited by its own dogmas, could not react with the same speed. It was a war in which the jungle punished both, but only one side could adapt. And just when it looked like the shotgun would be defeated by moisture, an unexpected factor emerged, a factor that could redefine its role in later combat, because when the Americans realized the real enemy inside the jungle, they initiated a quiet change that would completely transform the reliability of the weapon. And this change, which would come late for some battles, would be the surprising revelation of the next part. The dawn of August 21st, 1942, on the Tenaru River, brought to the surface the first real crack in Japanese confidence. The Ichiki detachment was advancing, convinced that the frontal impact, followed by the bayonet attack, would break through the fragile American line on Guadalcanal. The doctrine taught that, in the face of Japanese courage, the enemy would give in. Major Ichiki, a veteran of previous campaigns, believed that he was facing unprepared, improvised, and numerically inferior troops. He expected fear, hesitation, and withdrawal. What he found was something entirely different: defensive depth, overlapping firing ranges, and a combination of weapons that, in Japanese eyes, should not exist at that point on the map. Browning machine guns, positioned along the shore, created arcs of crossfire capable of turning the beach into a fatal corridor. The 37mm anti-tank guns, used in an improvised way as anti-personnel weapons, tore through the darkness with high-impact shots. But among these instruments, inconspicuous and almost invisible in official accounts, were Marines armed with 12-gauge shotguns, positioned not on the main line but in the infiltration areas, on the forested paths, at the points where the enemy was expected to try to bypass the machine guns. As soon as the Japanese realized that the river crossing was doomed, They began to seek the side shadows to try to penetrate the defenses. It was there, on these trails compressed by vegetation, that they heard for the first time the dry, metallic sound of the action being pulled, an unmistakable crack that no manual had predicted. There was no equivalent weapon in the Japanese arsenal, and no training prepared the soldier for the psychological impact of this noise. The silent attack, the basis of the pride of the Imperial Infantry, depended on the certainty that the enemy would be surprised. But when the night returned that harsh, repeated, firm sound, the Japanese soldier realized that the war on that front would not be fought in the terms he had imagined. The Americans, in turn, positioned the rifles with very specific objectives. They were not intended to decide the battle, but to prevent small infiltrations from opening breaches in the line of defense. The 12-gauge, loaded with buckshot, filled the room with dozens of shells that ricocheted off logs, branches, and rocks, creating a zone of denial far more chaotic and unpredictable than any standard infantry weapon. For a soldier accustomed to the clarity of the frontal assault, that sensory chaos was disorienting. The combat, which was supposed to be fought hand-to-hand, turned into a labyrinth of stampedes, echoing from improbable directions. Japanese doctrine required courage, but it did not provide answers to meet this kind of resistance. And the irony of this story is that the solution was in front of them. It was not a question of overcoming the enemy with morale, but of recognizing that modern warfare was dictated by technology, adaptation, and integration of armaments. If you are enjoying unraveling these facts, show your support. Like and subscribe so that we can bring you more detailed content about battles where reality has dismantled the certainties of rigid doctrines. As the Japanese attack collapsed, the psychological impact of the rifles became evident. Even when they weren't responsible for most of the casualties, they created an environment in which every bush seemed armed, every shadow concealed unpredictable gunfire. The Japanese soldier, conditioned to believe that the enemy retreated in the face of pressure, now advanced toward noises that betrayed readiness. The sound of the bomb action, repeated in the dark, sent a simple message. The opponent was prepared, awake, and positioned to kill at close range. This eroded the most important element of the Japanese attack: absolute confidence in the opponent's emotional collapse. The Battle of the Tanaru River ended in disaster for the Ichiki detachment. Nearly 800 Japanese died, many trying to reach positions where they imagined they would encounter faltering enemies. Instead, they found overlapping lines of fire, varied armaments, and immediate short-range responses. Later accounts show that some Japanese soldiers, unable to break the encirclement, repeatedly heard the sound of shotguns, even when they were not being used. The brain, conditioned by fear, filled the silence with threat. This detail illustrates the psychological dimension of the weapon. It wasn't just the lead that mattered, but the perception of unpredictability. The official story, however, almost erases the presence of the shotgun in this combat. The U.S. reports highlight the machine guns and cannons, while the Japanese hardly record the encounter. This absence in the documents does not diminish its impact. It only reinforces the unobtrusive nature of the instrument that the Japanese did not expect. The 12-gauge was not a weapon of protagonism, but a weapon of destabilization. He appeared where he was not supposed to be, and in doing so, dismantled the logic of the Japanese offensive. What the Ichiki detachment found that morning was the first concrete sign that the war in the Pacific would be decided not just by courage, but by integrated systems and unexpected weapons. And yet, the Battle of Tanaru was only the beginning. Because in the weeks to come, an even more disconcerting revelation would expose the gulf between doctrine and reality. Japan would discover that the weapon it despised not only existed in quantity, but was being produced on a scale that no Japanese official would believe possible. The statistic that would follow would shake more than morale. It would shake Japan's own understanding of military power. The absence of the 12-gauge rifle in Japanese manuals was not a simple technical oversight. It was a silence built over decades, a void that reflected the priorities, beliefs, and limitations of a doctrine forged for a war that no longer existed. The Imperial Army evaluated heavy machine guns, classified grenades by shrapnel shape, studied naval firing curves in detail, and devoted entire pages to countermeasures against American flamethrowers, whose 40-meter flame generated calculated terror. But in front of the shotgun there was not a single line. In the manuals recovered after the war, each weapon considered relevant was given a precise description: distance of engagement, vulnerabilities, methods of neutralization, form of use against American units. The absence of the rifle did not represent pure ignorance, but a reflection of the mental hierarchy of an army that saw war as ritual. The short, noisy, civilian-use weapon did not fit into any category of Japanese thought. It was not honorable like the bayonet, it was not decisive like the machine gun, it was not morally threatening like the flamethrower. It was, simply, invisible. And this invisibility gained ironic depth when one realizes that not even after battles in which some Japanese soldiers heard the sound of the action being carried out, was there any attempt to document the fact. Post-war interrogations with experienced commanders reveal astonishment when they are told that the Americans had used tens of thousands of these weapons. Some responded with skepticism. Others admitted to never having seen or considered the weapon in any field analysis. This gap is telling. For Japan, there was only that which had a measurable impact on paper, and Japanese reporting was rigidly guided by casualty statistics and strategic results. The shotgun, while effective in ambushes and night patrols, rarely produced significant numbers. Thus, its psychological effect on small infiltration groups disappeared in the statistical flow of large operations. In the American reports, the situation also contributed to the erasure. Machine guns, artillery, and combined strikes produced voluminous data that dominated the pages of after-action analyses. The shotgun was a niche weapon, used only by a few Marines and military police. Its function was to interrupt infiltrations, reinforce surveillance, and increase the sense of readiness. It was not a weapon capable of defining battles, but it was capable of preventing small defeats. Paradoxically, this made her less visible and more feared. The Japanese soldier who tried to approach in silence feared not the statistical impact of the weapon, but what it represented. The possibility that each step in the darkness would hide an abrupt, devastating, and impossible-to-avoid shot. A Japanese sergeant interrogated in 1946 reported hearing sounds like repeated little thunder, but could not identify them. Japanese doctrine, centered on direct combat, did not even have the vocabulary to describe that sensation. This conceptual silence was reinforced by another factor. The war in the Pacific did not provide Japan with sufficient opportunity to study the enemy. Isolated troops, massacred garrisons, or short battles prevented systematic analysis. The shotgun, because it operated precisely in these fragmented scenarios, became even more difficult to track. Its effectiveness, therefore, arose not from statistics, but from individual perception, and individual perceptions rarely make it into manuals. And yet it was precisely this absence that defined its historical importance. A gun doesn't have to be a protagonist to shape behavior. All it takes is specific moments of panic, unexpected setbacks, and the breakdown of predictability. And in each of these elements the rifle was present. Those who heard it never forgot the sound of the action being closed, the brief crack that announced that the silent attack would not be silent for long. Meanwhile, Japanese analysts remained concerned about weapons that, while powerful, were predictable: mortars, grenades, position machine guns. None of this, however, directly threatened the only element that sustained the doctrine of infiltration: the certainty of the first blow. The rifle destroyed this certainty, and destroying the enemy's certainty was, at bottom, more valuable than destroying his soldiers. But this understanding was never registered. Japan fought the entire war without fully understanding the instrument that undermined its more traditional tactics, and the greater irony is that, while the Japanese ignored the weapon, the Americans continued to produce it in impressive numbers, widening the conceptual gap between the two sides. The Japanese omission, therefore, became historical evidence of the difference between the two military mentalities. One sought to record everything that altered the battlefield. The other only recorded what fit his vision of combat. This intellectual chasm would be exposed even more clearly when American units began to request massive quantities of ammunition for specific functions, requests whose volume in itself gave away to Japan that something outside the parameters was happening. The truth of this disparity would come to light in the next revelation, a statistic that would show with surgical precision the true size of the gap between the two powers. The failure of expectations began almost silently. Like everything else in the Pacific jungle, the Marine Corps had received the shotguns with the implicit promise that at short ranges, no weapon would surpass its brutality. The employment doctrine was clear: forward patrols, night surveillance, infiltration points. Everything seemed aligned for the 12-gauge to become one of the most feared instruments of the war. But the tropical reality was relentless. Paper ammunition, used for decades in civilian production and maintained for industrial convenience, began to swell even before it entered combat. The soldiers reported that it was enough to carry the cartridge in their pocket for a few hours, for the moisture to impregnate the thickness of the material. The result was a warped cylinder, too hard to feed into the chamber but soft enough to tear when pressed. Frustration grew daily. The Marine who relied on the weapon for approach combat found at the critical moment that the cartridge simply did not fit. Some tried to dry the ammunition in the sun. Others wrapped the cartridges in pieces of rubber torn from raincoats. There were more extreme reports. Soldiers using the bayonet handle as a hammer to force ammunition into the chamber. In several cases, this practice damaged the weapon irreparably. It was a technical disaster that did not fit the grandiose image of the American industrial machine. The Army, aware of the failure, was slow to react. There were clear priorities: rifle ammunition, machine gun ammunition, mortars, artillery. The shotgun, a niche weapon, has never been given sufficient logistical priority to compete with these projects. Paper ammunition continued to be sent, even when field reports called for immediate replacement. The problem, paradoxically, was not a lack of industrial capacity. The United States had the resources to produce brass ammunition on a massive scale. What was missing was a doctrinal priority. Because the shotgun did not generate large numbers of casualties, its importance was minimized. The American system, although gigantic, followed a pragmatic logic. It invested in what killed the most, and the shotgun did not compete with machine guns and grenades in absolute numbers. Thus, it continued to exist in a kind of operational limbo, efficient in theory, flawed in practice, but present enough to be feared in specific situations. The contrast between potential and reality became evident in the patrols. The rifle was carried by the most experienced soldier, the one who made his way through the jungle. He was advancing within a few yards of the enemy, exposed to ambushes and traps. His weapon was to be the first response, the first barrier, the first burst of deadly fire. But when the ammunition swelled, this soldier was reduced to a gun that would not fire. It was a kind of cruel punishment, the ideal instrument, sabotaged by its own environment. In several reports, Marines claim that after days of rain, the shotgun became nothing more than a baton with a bayonet. The soldier was obliged to replace it with a Garand rifle or a Thompson, less devastating weapons at short ranges, but reliable. This frustration also appeared in the testimonies of gunsmiths in the rifle divisions. They noted that shotguns, unlike rifles and machine guns, rarely showed combat wear. The pieces did not break. The mechanisms did not fail. The problem was not with the gun, but with the ammunition. It was a bitter irony. The weapon was too robust to be blamed. It was the cartridge, the weakest link, that made her irrelevant in many combats. And while this was happening, the war continued its chaotic course. The jungle swallowed plans, dissolved training, humiliated doctrines. The Americans were able to adapt, improvise, modify. But paper ammunition endured as an industrial relic, surviving only because no one prioritized its replacement. The delay in introducing the M19 brass cartridge has become a symbol of this negligence. It was not until March 1945, 3 years after Guadalcanal and months before the end of the war, that the Army finally adopted the new standard. The M19 solved all problems. It did not swell, it did not deform, it did not bind, it did not absorb water. It was all the shotgun needed to reach its full potential. But the late arrival prevented the weapon from achieving prominence in the most dramatic combats of the campaign. By the time the cartridge finally went into production, the decisive battles were almost complete. History, therefore, has recorded the shotgun not as a revolutionary weapon, but as a technical curiosity. The lack of logistical priority has turned a powerful weapon into a footnote, a defeat caused not by the enemy, but by the administration of the war itself. This erasure also influenced the memory of the veterans. Many of them did not even mention the shotgun in post-war accounts, not out of insignificance, but because it rarely worked consistently. It was hard to create heroic stories with a weapon that failed when it mattered most. Thus, the American 12-gauge remained shrouded in contradiction, lethal when it worked, useless when the jungle decided otherwise. The Japanese soldier feared his snap, but the American soldier feared his uncertainty. This double fear shaped the perception of the gun in a unique way. It was a psychological instrument more than decisive, a presence more than a statistic. The final irony of this phase of history lies in the fact that the United States, a power capable of designing intercontinental bombers and aircraft carriers at a rapid pace, delayed the production of a simple brass cartridge for years. A delay that limited the impact of a weapon that, in theory, could have altered entire jungle combat tactics. But the conflict in the Pacific was not only decided by weapons, it was decided by industrial priorities, and the shotgun was simply not on the priority list. However, the next chapter of this trajectory would reveal something even more profound. Even with technical failures and imperfect ammunition, it would continue to play an invisible but decisive role in critical niches of the war, a role that Japan has never understood, and that would make its doctrinal absence all the more revealing. What would come next would show that, in addition to the ammunition it betrayed, there was a second factor that would define the fate of this forgotten weapon. The mythology of the 12-gauge shotgun began long after the last shot in the Pacific, when Hollywood turned the gun into the protagonist of claustrophobic scenes that never occurred as they were filmed. Post-war American cinema needed direct and understandable symbols, and few images were as cinematic as a Marine advancing into a bunker with a short gun that breathed fire in quick bursts. Films of the 1950s and 1960s amplified this portrayal, creating the impression that the shotgun had been as common as the Garand or the Thompson, when in reality its operational role had been restricted, fragmented, and even problematic. The weapon's absence from action reports and veterans' memories contrasted sharply with its exuberant screen presence. The veteran who marched for hours carrying swollen and unusable ammunition did not recognize the cinematic hero who cleared fortified positions with perfect shots. The divergence was so great that later scholars came to believe that documents had been lost. Such was the difference between myth and record. But the problem was not the lack of documentation, it was the excess of popular imagination. The shotgun was convenient for the cinema because it created instant tension. Its short bursts filled the frame, and the slam fire looked like something out of a secret urban warfare manual. Video games of the late 20th century amplified this myth, reinforcing the image of the weapon as a universal solution for close combat. The truth, however, is that the shotgun has almost never been used in bunkers. Artillery, flamethrowers, and explosives were the real tools of this type of operation. This discrepancy only widened when streamlined war publications adopted training photographs as if they were authentic combat records, further confusing the public and crystallizing the weapon as the ultimate icon of close-quarters engagement. At the height of the Cold War, publishers sought stories of individual bravery, and the shotgun served that narrative well, because it suggested intimate, decisive, visceral confrontation. For an urban audience, it offered an understandable aesthetic. It was not too technical like a bar, nor abstract like naval fire. It was direct, palpable, almost primitive. The problem is that this aesthetic has replaced analysis. When Hollywood featured a Marine making his way through Japanese caves, the viewer did not see months of rain, mud, failing ammunition, and confusing doctrines. He saw only a heroic gesture, and it was this gesture that shaped the collective memory. Popular literature repeated the process, describing battles in dramatized language that prioritized emotional impact over historical accuracy. In many of these accounts, the shotgun was treated as if it defined jungle warfare, when the data shows exactly the opposite. To size this distance between myth and reality, consider an often overlooked fact. In 1944, the United States produced more than 2 million M1 Garand rifles, while in the same period, it manufactured just over 50,000 combat rifles. This discrepancy is so colossal that it dismantles the fiction of equivalence. If you were surprised by this difference, comment on logistics wins to record the impact that real scale imposes on the popular narrative. Unlike the weapons starring in fiction, the rifle lived mainly on the margins of the war, playing specific roles that rarely entered the official accounts. But popular culture does not work with margins. She works with images, and the image of the rifleman holding the shotgun was too powerful to ignore. It was the perfect synthesis of individual courage facing the enemy at the most dangerous point on the battlefield. The distortion grew to such an extent that many came to believe that Japan had been caught by surprise strategically by the shotgun, when, in fact, The surprise occurred only in small close-range encounters and never determined the course of operations on a large scale. The weapon was feared in ambushes, but irrelevant in structured offensives. It was useful for scares, but ineffective against defenses in depth. Even so, the myth thrived because it filled a narrative need, the idea that wars can be explained by individual actions, and not by logistical, industrial, and technological chains. The mythology of the shotgun allowed the public to believe that a single man, armed with courage and a rustic weapon, could change the balance of the conflict. However, as more documents were opened and serious analysis compared numbers, it became clear that the real story was very different from the one shown. And it is precisely this distance between myth and fact that sets the stage for the next revelation. The moment when the crushing weight of American production has incontrovertibly exposed the gulf between Japanese expectation and material reality. The true legacy of this story begins in silence, in that narrow space between what the Japanese believed they would face and what they actually found in the shadows of the jungle. The infantry of the Imperial Army marched trusting in a set of certainties that seemed unshakable. Moral superiority would guarantee the initiative. The night attack would dissolve American resistance. The bayonet, a symbol of martial purity, would pave the way where machines failed. It was a doctrine built on decades of conflict on the Asian continent, reinforced by victories against ill-equipped forces, and protected by a quasi-religious belief that Western modernity failed in hand-to-hand combat. The encounter with the 12-gauge shotgun, therefore, did not act as a strategic break, but as a brutal reminder that modern warfare was rapidly moving away from that ideal of martial purity. For the Japanese, to hear the metallic crack of the action being armed in the dark was to witness the failure of their own expectation of the enemy. They had prepared for heavy machinery, for controlled fire, for battles where they knew the rate of fire on the enemy, but the shotgun broke that logic, introducing the chaos of instant firepower that didn't fit into the charts and manuals they had memorized since basic training. Still, as impactful as the initial contact was, she never decided battles. The decisive weight was far above the range of a single shot. It was the whole structure of the war that crushed Japanese doctrine, and not the particular surprise of a weapon that, in the end, was more symbol than solution. The shotgun exposed the error of origin. Japan had entered into an industrial conflict with tools from another era. The discrepancy between expectation and reality began in the philosophical field, widened in the logistical field, and materialized in the tactical field. There was no possible preparation to face a war machine that delivered, every month, more steel than Japan produced in a year. There was no bayonet to compensate for the absence of armor, fuel, or enough ammunition to sustain prolonged operations. There was no night attack that would nullify radars, naval artillery, and constant air support. The shotgun existed in this set of contrasts as a kind of uncomfortable footnote, too small to be considered in strategic statistics, but large enough to hurt the morale of soldiers who believed they dominated at close range. Japan has never developed countermeasures because it has never identified the weapon as a systemic threat, and he did not identify why, in practice, the war had already been decided by the industry, and not by the meeting between two silhouettes in the darkness. The Americans didn't need the shotgun to win. They needed only to keep moving their logistical colossus forward, island by island, carrying tanks, ships, fuel, medics, radios, shells, and planes, until every Japanese position was consumed by the accumulated weight of an effort Japan could never match. The tactical surprise of the shotguns was only a symptom of this difference. It revealed the abyss between two ways of looking at war. On the one hand, a power that treated each weapon as a specific tool in a larger gear. On the other, an army that still believed that spiritual strength would solve material failures. The characteristic sound of bomb action being armed, repeated among soggy trees, was less of a physical threat and more of a reminder of the doctrinal obsolescence that Japan insisted on denying. In many accounts, Japanese soldiers described dread not of the shot, but of what it symbolized, the awareness that their own teachings failed in the face of a weapon they deemed unworthy of study. This feeling of fighting something that was not foreseen is the true legacy of the shotgun in the memory of the Pacific. It did not turn battles. It did not put down offensives. It did not destroy entire units. But it destroyed an illusion, the illusion that war could be contained on static principles, that spiritual preparation could compensate for logistical limitations, and that the enemy would fight according to previously studied standards. By ignoring the rifle, Japan exposed its own intellectual fragility, trapped in a doctrine that froze military thinking in the past, and this freeze was costly. As the war progressed into more intense phases, the inability to adjust tactics and recognize new threats proved fatal. The shotgun was only the first of many ignored signals. The true legacy of this encounter, therefore, is not in the number of casualties, nor in the frequency of use, nor in the iconographic presence that popular culture attributed to the weapon. It resides in what it revealed, the clash between a force that was constantly evolving and another that remained a prisoner of its own myth. In the end, it wasn't the rifle that beat Japan. It was modern warfare that crushed a doctrine that had already stashed before the first shots were fired. And it is precisely this realization that prepares us for the next chapter, where a seemingly simple statistic will make clear how much Japan underestimated the world around it, and how much this underestimation cost more than any weapon could ever inflict. The geography of defeat in the Pacific began long before the first shot, and imposed itself as a decisive force on every Japanese unit that landed on islands whose very existence favored the enemy. While Japan advanced guided by the belief that spirit and courage could compensate for material limitations, the United States operated from a completely different logic. Each island was a supply node, each runway a strategic multiplier, each inlet a makeshift port capable of holding tons of fuel, ammunition, and steel. Once an island fell, it wasn't just territory that changed hands. It was infrastructure, air range, sea lanes, and the ability to project power hundreds of miles away. The 12-gauge shotgun in this panorama appeared as a small but symbolic piece. It represented the resource that exists only when the industry has so much surplus that it can distribute thousands of specialized weapons, even though it knows that they will occupy small combat niches. For Japan, on the contrary, each weapon produced had to fulfill more than one function. There was no room for specialization because there was no capacity for waste. On islands such as Guadalcanal, Bougainville, and Tarawa, this difference was evident in the first days of combat. American forces arrived with engineers, generators, tractors, and collapsible depots. With each beach conquered, new cement blocks began to rise. Fuel tanks appeared in the clearings and roads were opened at a speed that surprised even allies. Meanwhile, the Japanese infantry landed with the bare minimum, relying on the belief that quick victory would invalidate the need for long supply lines. The problem was that the Pacific did not forgive optimism. The sheer distance between Japanese bases and front lines made any attempt to resupply an extreme risk. American submarines interrupted convoys. Planes attacked cargo ships. Every ton of ammunition lost was a gap that would never be filled. The 12-gauge shotgun, by contrast, arrived on the islands in protected boxes, stacked alongside thousands of Garand rifles, machine guns, radios, and shovels. It was one of dozens of weapons available, an optional tool that only existed because the American logistics system didn't just work, it was left over. And it was this surplus that broke Japanese doctrine faster than any shot. On each island, the same ritual was repeated. The Americans created a more efficient base than the previous one, generating a progressive cycle where each victory strengthened the next. Japan, on the other hand, saw its positions turn into isolated bubbles. Without resupply, his soldiers fought with limited ammunition, rationed food, and improvised equipment. When a Japanese detachment heard the metallic action of a shotgun being armed in the dark, the fear never came only from the imminent firing. It came from the tacit understanding that this sound represented something greater. It showed that the enemy had so much material available that he could place in the hands of a night sentry a weapon that Japan itself would never be able to produce on a large scale. Even if Japan identified the need for countermeasures for the shotgun, it would have no means to manufacture, distribute, and adapt them for each battlefront. Japanese doctrine, stuck in the belief that war would be defined by tenacity, ignored the geographical dynamics that made this philosophy untenable. Each island was a prison, surrounded by ocean, with no escape routes, no possibility of rapid troop replacement. The Americans, by contrast, treated each island as a platform, conquered today, used tomorrow, enlarged the next, and turned into a springboard for the next leap. The rifle only reinforced this contrast, because it was a weapon of contingency, of opportunity, of a specific occasion. It was there because the American system could afford to predict almost anything. Japan, in contrast, planned only what it believed it controlled. However, geography showed that control was illusory. By the end of 1943, as the Solomon campaigns were advancing, American analysts were already observing that each island taken expanded the operational arc of bombers, reduced logistical distances, and further strangled Japan. This meant that, even before direct confrontations, Japan was already losing by the mathematics of distances. The 12-gauge shotgun was just one detail in this big equation, but it was a detail that revealed the whole picture. The U.S. Marine carrying her was supported by ships, aircraft carriers, forward bases, fuel tanks, and a supply line that crossed the largest ocean on the planet without interruption. The Japanese soldier, on the other hand, carried the bayonet with faith but without refueling. It carried conviction, but it did not carry enough ammunition for prolonged offensives. The real clash happened when these two worlds met. For Japan, to realize that the enemy possessed not only large weapons but also dozens of specialized small weapons, was to realize that the war was already lost on a strategic scale. An army that could send out shotguns en masse could also send everything else en masse. And he did. The geography of the Pacific didn't just shape the combat. It laid out the stark truth about which side was actually able to sustain the war. And that truth paves the way for the next revelation, when American industrial capacity itself surpassed not only Japan's, but the sum of all Axis expectations, creating a difference so profound that no Japanese plan, no matter how good, could make up. The weight of American industry began to crush Japan long before the first Pacific landings took place, and this material superiority explained more about the war than any bayonet duel or clash of doctrines. While Tokyo still celebrated the idea that the war would be won by the spiritual strength of the soldier, Washington converted entire factories into machines of continuous production, where each turn added thousands of tons of steel to the military effort. In 1942, when Japan believed it could sustain simultaneous campaigns in China, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific, the United States produced more steel in a month than Japan did in an entire year. It was such an overwhelming difference that it invalidated any strategy based on prolonged resistance. Japan was making Arisaka rifles by drops, struggling to replace losses. The United States produced Garand rifles at an industrial rate, reaching more than 2 million units in 1944. And in the meantime, they found the time and resources to manufacture tens of thousands of 12-gauge shotguns, weapons that they saw as auxiliary, almost peripheral, used in specific niches of jungle warfare. Each of these shotguns existed because American industry could afford to produce not only what was necessary, but also what was redundant. This stark contrast explained why Japan never anticipated the massive use of the shotgun. It wasn't that her strategists considered her irrelevant, it was that they could not even imagine an enemy capable of distributing such specialized weapons in such remote theaters. The Japanese doctrine of spirit trumps machine was often presented as military philosophy, but in practice it was a direct result of shortages. Japan did not have enough coal, enough steel, enough oil, enough machinery, enough engineers. There was no way to compete in technological innovation with a superpower that supplied its forces with gigantic production margins. A 12-gauge rifle in the hands of an American sentry represented something for Japan that its own economy could not understand. Excess material, excess transportation, excess capacity, and in this excess was the announced defeat. The numbers exposed this reality with brutal clarity. In 1943, while Japan produced approximately 8 million rifle rounds per month, the United States exceeded 400 million in the same period. In automatic weapons, the Japanese manufactured limited quantities of Type 96 and Type 99 machine guns, often replacing parts with low-quality wood or metal due to a lack of steel. The Americans, by contrast, produced more than 600,000 Browning machine guns in 3 years, and still had the capacity to manufacture millions of magazines, spare parts, and maintenance kits. The disparity was so great that it made the shotgun, technically marginal, seem like a futuristic luxury. Japan could barely equip its units with reliable radios. The United States even equipped engineering teams with portable communication, searchlights, generators, and ammunition fueled by ships that roamed the Pacific without interruption. Victory, therefore, took place before the combat. This industrial structure also shaped the way weapons were viewed on the battlefield. For Americans, the 12-gauge shotgun was an instrument of opportunity, ideal for patrols, ambushes, and night deterrence. It didn't need to be decisive because it was just one piece in a vast arsenal. For Japan, each weapon needed to be multi-purpose and decisive because there were not enough replacements. The presence of shotguns in American operations, even when they failed due to paper ammunition, was a visible demonstration of what really decided the conflict: diversity and volume. Captured Japanese soldiers often reported surprise at discovering how many different guns a single American division carried. They counted M1919 machine guns, Garand rifles, Thompson submachine guns, M1 carbines, bars, flamethrowers, bazookas, mortars, grenades of all kinds, and in between the shotgun, silent in its role but eloquent as a symbol of abundance. In the end, the Japanese shock in front of the shotgun did not come from the direct impact of the weapon, but from the perception of impotence in the face of an enemy that always had more ammunition, more transports, more spare capacity. It was a system that never stopped, powered by railroads, steel mills, refineries, and ships that crossed oceans at an industrial pace. Even when the Americans improvised, they improvised with plenty of it. Even when they made mistakes with surpluses. Japan, on the contrary, improvised with absence. This structural difference, not the effectiveness of a particular caliber, explained why Japanese doctrine collapsed on each new island. They fought with admirable discipline but against unbeatable mathematics. The shotgun was just one symptom of this unequal equation, a small gun in an ocean of greatness. And yet, it revealed something essential. If Japan was surprised by a detail as peripheral as the rifle, how could it face everything that really mattered? How to fight tanks without steel, how to sustain offensives without fuel, how to compete with an opponent who built ships in weeks. The collapse was announced in the numbers, and those numbers didn't lie. And it is precisely for this reason that the next stage of this story will reveal the point at which even the most confident Axis strategists recognized that they were not facing a common enemy. They were facing a continental factory capable of turning resources into victory at a pace that no doctrine could stop. The night in the Pacific was not just darkness. It was psychological territory where the Imperial Japanese Army believed it had absolute advantage. For decades, his doctrine had been built on the belief that the night attack dissolved the power of Western technology, reducing machine guns, radios, and artillery to useless props in the face of the silent blade that was advancing. The Japanese instructors claimed that darkness leveled all armies, and that courage was the decisive factor. But that conviction began to crumble when the first American battalions, exhausted and soaking wet, began to use the 12-gauge rifle as a psychological barrier in the darkness. The sound of the action being triggered, metallic, short, and unmistakable, ran through the clearings as a warning and promise. The gun did not need to fire to destroy the Japanese ritual of silent attack. It was enough to exist. Fragmentary accounts of thwarted raids show that Japanese patrols retreated when they heard the first burst of scattered fire, because at that moment they realized that the invisible approach had lost power. It was not the force of the projectile that devastated. It was the breaking of expectation. Japanese doctrine depended on confidence, almost faith, that the enemy would remain blind and deaf until physical contact. The shotgun broke that trust with a single snap. With each confrontation, the weapon gained more symbolic contours. American scouts kept her at the edge of the line, always positioned where infiltration was expected. Often, it did not even appear in the reports, because the documents prioritized weapons that caused quantifiable casualties. But on the ground, she was a sentry of steel, and her short range turned into a warning that any Japanese advance would end in an immediate and devastating clash. The silent panic described by Japanese survivors emerges indirectly. Letters speaking of lookouts, who heard the sound of the enemy preparing the attack, or commanders recording that the approach failed due to the sudden alert of the adversary. What was really there was the noise of an American soldier pulling the butt, announcing what would come if someone took another step. It was a kind of fear that didn't appear in the statistics, but shaped the night of an entire island. The Japanese patrols advanced calculating shadows and distance, but the presence of the rifle created gaps in the route. Paths once considered safe became areas of doubt. The logic was simple. If a single American with a 12-gauge was at that point, the infiltration would lose the element that justified it. And since the Japanese had never studied the weapon, they didn't know how many buckshot grenades it could fire in a few seconds, nor how the slam fire turned each pumping pull into another impact. This created a rare phenomenon in the Pacific theater, the refusal of contact. On several occasions, patrols that were supposed to test American defenses simply disappeared into the bush without fulfilling the mission, returning at dawn with elusive and incomplete justifications. It was as if the doctrine they had shouted at the training level fell apart when confronted with the noise that the jungle amplified. This psychological effect became even more significant when compared to the global context of the war. Japan believed that the night erased the power of Western technology, while Germany, on the other side of the world, also underestimated the true extent of American industrial capacity. And this is where a fact emerges that completely dismantles the perception of the Axis. In 1943, while Germany struggled to produce about 6,000 fighter planes, the United States produced more than 80,000 in the same period. If this contrast is astonishing, the viewer can register this reaction with a simple comment like, "Shocking data," because this is the real scale of the war that shaped every rifle, and every battle. The same industry capable of manufacturing such an absurd number of aircraft was responsible for dumping thousands of 12-gauge rifles into the Pacific without affecting the pace of strategic production in the slightest. The shotgun thus became more than a weapon. It was a reminder that American dominance came from the top of the chain, not the end. Their presence in night watches indicated that the war was being fought by an army that had enough material abundance to cover even the details. This crushed Japanese morale, because it indicated that there was no way to defeat a force that had reserves for everything, even specialized weapons that many countries did not even consider relevant. And each night, when a Japanese soldier approached in silence and heard that metallic sound of the action being armed, he understood that he was facing not just one man, but the entire structure that had placed that weapon there. It was industrial weight materialized in a single gesture. This psychological dimension reached its apex when the first infiltration operations began to fail repeatedly, not because the Americans had more men, but because they had tools that multiplied their presence. A sentry with a rifle could be enough to stop an entire patrol. This realization produced an emotional exhaustion that no statistics recorded, but which would become decisive throughout the campaigns. And it is precisely this weariness, this invisible fracture, that paves the way for the next revelation. The moment when even Japanese strategists began to admit, albeit in silence, that something far greater than courage and discipline was determining the course of the war. The 12-gauge shotgun has always been remembered for the force of impact, but to understand its true role in the Pacific, one must look at what really shaped the war. On the battlefield, there was an invisible hierarchy defined not by glamour or the aesthetics of weapons, but by their ability to decide entire operations. And within that hierarchy, the 12-gauge occupied a narrow niche, while other tools took on the structural weight of the American victory. The M1 Garand, for example, was the backbone of the infantry. Its semi-automatic cadence allowed each American soldier to produce a volume of fire that the Japanese infantry, still reliant on bolt-action rifles, could never match. The BR functioned as a tactical anchor, offering portable suppression fire at a steady pace. 60mm and 81mm mortars pushed the fighting behind the hills, destroying positions that would previously have been approached only with bayonets. And the flamethrower, perhaps the most feared weapon in the Pacific theater, completely redefined combat in caves and bunkers, driving off Japanese defenders even when geography seemed invincible. These systems, rifles, light machine guns, mortars, flamethrowers, were the cornerstones of American warfare, bolstered by a fourth element that no single weapon could match: naval artillery. Every island the Japanese tried to defend was inevitably made a target for battleships, cruisers, and destroyers that dropped tons of shells before the landing craft reached the sand. A single salvo from an ironclad was equivalent to the weight of dozens of truckloads of ammunition, something Japan could never replicate. In this scenario, the rifle was shadow and detail, acting in the interval between the silence of the night and the first flash of the rifles. The simplest proof of this is that Japan developed countermeasures for everything that really mattered. Against the M1 Garand, they reinforced defensive positions and created staggered firing ranges. Against the bar, they built deep and protected machine gun nests. Against American mortars, they dug spider hole burrows, designed specifically to break the line of shrapnel. Against naval artillery, they adopted defenses in depth, installing bunkers that used hills as shock absorbers. Against flamethrowers, they developed internal chambers that dissipated heat and allowed underground escapes. Japanese doctrine evolved, even limited, to try to meet every real threat that arose in the field. But there was never any formal countermeasure against the shotgun, not because they only underestimated it, but because it never reached the strategic threshold necessary to be considered a systemic threat. The Japanese feared the immediate impact of the weapon in ambushes, but this fear was never studied because its tactical consequences were too small in the face of weapons that actually destroyed entire positions. Even so, the rifle managed to occupy a peculiar space. It did not decide battles but influenced moments. In close combat, inside narrow trails, it inverted the Japanese logic of silent attack. In night vigils, he broke the ritual of invisible advancement. On patrols, it offered quick safety for the scout walking the most vulnerable line. But when compared to the forces that really shaped the campaign, its limitations became clear. Naval artillery could destroy weeks of defensive work in minutes. American mortars reached positions that no shotgun would ever touch. The Garand ensured individual fire superiority in all open encounters. The bar kept up the pace of the units. The flamethrowers opened caves that Japan believed impregnable. And above all, American naval logistics, supplying men, weapons, food, fuel, ammunition, medicine, tools, sustained this arsenal relentlessly, while Japan watched its supply lines unravel under the combined action of submarines and bombers. The shotgun existed in this ecosystem as a reflection of American surplus, not as a pillar. Each 12-gauge box sent to the Pacific represented something the Japanese simply did not have: the ability to supply tactical niches without compromising strategic priorities. And that was when the contrast became more painful. For Japan, a lost rifle was a serious problem. For the United States, a lost rifle was just one more in a sea of replaceable equipment. This is the point that later studies clearly reveal. The rifle was not the symbol of American strength, but rather the symbol that American strength was so vast that it could include secondary weapons without representing logistical burden. It was this luxury, not lethality, that really frightened the enemy. With each island, with each advance, with each night broken by a short shot, the truth that shaped the Pacific theater became clearer. The rifle was impressive, but it was the gigantic structure that allowed it to be there that decided. And it is precisely this contrast between the emotional impact of the weapon and the actual weight of the machines and systems that paves the way for the next revelation, the moment when Japan realized, definitively, that it was not facing an army, but a continental gear capable of replacing any loss and extending any victory at an unmatched speed. The surviving testimonies of the Pacific Campaign reveal a little-discussed layer of the war, a layer in which the 12-gauge rifle appears not as a protagonist, but as a constant, silent, and sometimes frustrating presence. When American veterans describe the gun, their words carry an almost uncomfortable honesty. They remember it as a useful tool on nights when the jungle seemed to close in on positions, when every snap of a branch could herald a Japanese infiltration. They remember the weight of the gun in the continuous rain, the feeling of immediate security it provided when it was wielded in the narrow corridor between palm trees and exposed roots. However, almost none of them describe it enthusiastically. Instead, their memories return again and again to the same point: limited reliability, ammunition failing at the moment it mattered most, range too short for engagements that often required mid-range suppression tactics. It is significant that many testimonies only mention the shotgun when asked directly, as if its presence had been important, but never decisive. One Marine recalled that it was excellent for night watchmen, but useless when the patrol made contact with the enemy beyond 10 meters. Another said he preferred to carry a Garand whenever possible, because the shotgun, while powerful, could rarely be properly fueled amid the extreme humidity. A third reported that he spent more time cleaning swollen cartridges than training with the weapon. This kind of frankness completely dismantles the cinematic aura that formed around the shotgun after the war. In oral accounts, it appears as an instrument of occasion, not as a heroic symbol, and the silence around it becomes even more important when contrasted with the vibrant stories told about the bar, the Garand, and the flamethrower, weapons constantly cited as responsible for saving lives and turning positions. This contrast reveals something profound about the nature of military memory. Veterans tend to remember what worked when nothing else did. They remember the gun that responded at the exact second that survival depended on it. The shotgun, when it worked, was devastating, but when it failed, it left the soldier exposed and vulnerable. And this vulnerability seems to have marked more deeply than its potency. The silence about the gun also has practical roots. Many Marines simply did not use it often enough to create strong memories. It remained longer in the hands of sentries, scouts, or perimeter guards than in offensive positions. The great battles, the ones that shaped the narrative of the war, rarely included the shotgun as a central element. Thus, as they recounted their experiences, the veterans naturally gravitated toward the weapons that were present at the most tense moments. The fact that the shotgun doesn't occupy that space explains why it almost disappears when the stories are revised decades later. There is also an element of logistical shame, rarely mentioned but noticeable between the lines. The soldiers knew that the paper ammunition was flawed. They knew they were marching with cartridges that could swell at any moment. They knew they depended on a weapon whose reliability fluctuated according to the weather forecast. In an army driven by industrial precision, engaging the enemy with ammunition that needed to be hammered into the chamber could sound like an unforgivable oversight. And what sounds like carelessness does not usually become a heroic story. The result is that the shotgun, despite being present, hardly appears in official memories. It lives in marginal comments, short sentences, secondary memories. Even so, when he appears, he makes it clear that his influence was real, although invisible to the grand narrative. In many testimonies, veterans describe nights when they heard the Japanese approaching and cocked the gun only to signal to the enemy that the element of surprise was over. This gesture, repeated countless times, sustained the line of defense. The gun didn't need to fire. His presence solved it. In other accounts, soldiers tell how the shotgun prevented infiltrations in areas covered by vegetation, where visibility disappeared in seconds. The wide firing with rapid spread was just what they needed when the jungle swallowed the enemy's contours. Yet even in these testimonies, there is always a note of caution, almost resignation. The gun solved small problems, but it didn't solve big problems. It didn't turn into battles. He did not break through defensive lines. It did not break down fortified positions. It only protected, for a moment, the immediate space around the soldier. What remains, then, is a fragmented memory, useful, present, sometimes decisive but always limited by context. And this limitation is what makes silence even more revealing, because he points to an uncomfortable truth. The shotgun was a weapon that operated between the heroic and the ordinary, but which was swallowed up by the colossal scale of modern warfare. And it is precisely this realization that paves the way for the next part, where the impact of the weapon will reveal itself not in the individual accounts, but in the way it interacted with the Japanese tactical collapse at the height of the campaign. The arrival of the M19 brass cartridge in March 1945 represents one of the most ironic episodes in American arms history in the Pacific. The perfect solution, created too late to import. For nearly 3 years of war, the 12-gauge shotgun had lived with a limitation so obvious that it became almost cruel, ammunition that could not withstand the environment in which the weapon was most needed. The paper cartridge, which worked well in the dry training fields, turned into a sponge in the island's rainforests. It swelled, jammed, tore to the touch. Soldiers who depended on immediate firing were required to strike the butt against the chamber or abandon the cartridge altogether. With brass, all of this disappears instantly. The new ammunition is waterproof, robust, insensitive to the weather. It remains functional even after hours of exposure to moisture. The mechanical action of the shotgun, especially in the Model 97 with its ferocious slam fire, becomes smooth, reliable, steady. If it had existed since Guadalcanal, the practical history of the weapon would have been different. Brass transforms the rifle into everything instructors imagined in 1942, a shock instrument, a force multiplier in degraded environments, an objective response to close-quarters combat. The irony of this story is that the solution was in front of them. If you're enjoying unraveling these facts, show your support. Like and subscribe so we can bring you more in-depth content. However, by the time the M19 finally arrives at the units, the strategic picture of the Pacific has already changed. The defining battles, Guadalcanal, Bougainville, Tarawa, Saipan, Peleliu, Iwo Jima, were fought without him. The shotgun, already marginalized by doctrine, logistics, and geography, does not receive the redemption it deserved. Now fully reliable, she finds herself employed in secondary roles, patrols, prisoner guard, rear security. It becomes, ironically, perfect the moment its perfection no longer alters the course of anything. This is because in 1945, the logic of Pacific warfare no longer depended on individual weapons. It depended on systems. It depended on the American ability to transport, fuel, and project power on industrial scales. The 12-gauge shotgun, even in its most reliable version, was just an atom inside a larger machine, a machine that included aircraft carriers, naval artillery, light and heavy mortars, steady supplies, advanced engineering crews, flamethrower tanks, and thousands of tons of equipment, landing daily. The question historians ask themselves is simple. If the M19 had been adopted in August 1942, would it have changed the physical history of the shotgun in the Pacific? The answer is, without a doubt. With reliable ammunition, she would have been employed in many more jungle patrols, many more night watchmen, many more ambushes and perimeter defenses. The psychological impact, already significant even with failed cartridges, would have multiplied. American doctrine would probably have expanded the use of the weapon, incorporating it more explicitly into combat groups. In the caves of Peleliu, the ravines of Guadalcanal, and the dense palm trees of Bougainville, the brass cartridge would have turned chaotic encounters into instant eliminations. But the real story is far less generous. When it is finally distributed, the M19 encounters a war that is no longer the same. In Okinawa, the main engagements take place at medium and long range. In fortification systems that require heavy artillery and flamethrowers, the rifles appear only in the final clearance, in the last refuges, in the moments when the fight is already decided. The technical tragedy of the M19 is exactly this. It represents the apex of a weapon that matures just when its own tactical space disappears. If the Pacific War had started 2 years later, the shotgun would be remembered as the protagonist. As everything happened before, she survives only as a shadow. Still, the M19 leaves a legacy, even if subtle. It redefines the role of the shotgun in the post-war period. It proves that the concept was sound, that the gun was not a flaw, just its ammunition. In Vietnam, decades later, when the jungles close in again on American patrols, it will be precisely the brass cartridge, a direct descendant of this late M19, that will allow the rifle to be reborn as an essential weapon. But at that point in 1945, the war that could have been shaped by her had already morphed into another. The Pacific, once a labyrinth of dark jungles and invisible ambushes, becomes a chessboard of large combined operations, in which destroyers, planes, and marines move in industrial synchrony. The M19 arrives as the final stage of a chapter that was already being closed. His technical perfection, impeccable, becomes a bitter reminder of lost potential. And it is precisely this potential, this almost, that opens the door to the next moment of the narrative, because the real turning point is not in technology, but in what Japan did when it finally realized that the war it was fighting was no longer the war it had imagined. The trajectory of the 12-gauge rifle in the Pacific rests on a paradox that bothers any historian. It was devastating enough to mark those who heard it fire, but not decisive enough to figure in the reports that shaped the official memory of the war. The weapon operated in the narrow space between emotional impact and strategic irrelevance, between immediate terror and documentary insignificance. To the Japanese infantry, trained for silence, night advances, and ritualized bayonet combat, the first bang of a rifle sounded like a break, not just from a tactic, but from a belief. There was no honor in death at 5 meters, without seeing the enemy, without dueling, without blade. There was only darkness, explosion, scattering of lead. It was the opposite of the war that his generals promised. And yet, for the American High Command, the same weapon occupied an almost bureaucratic place. It was useful, but not essential, dangerous, but not defining, efficient, but far from being a priority in supplies, doctrine, or transportation. The irony is that this combination, fearsome for those who faced it, secondary for those who used it, condemned the rifle to a historic gray area where few weapons reside. The bar generated reports. The flamethrower generated doctrines. Garand generated statistics. The shotgun generated silence. Silence on papers, not in the jungles. And this administrative silence is revealing. During the post-war period, American analysts reviewing the use of armaments for future conflicts simply ignored their potential. not out of negligence but because the weapon left no measurable traces. There were no effectiveness tables, hit probability charts, tactical impact estimates, or ammunition consumption calculations. A weapon that operates in seconds, at such short distances, tends to disappear in the records. Unlike a mortar or a tank, it does not leave craters, does not alter maps, does not destroy bunkers. It only changes the instant, that moment when two patrols meet at a bend in a river or in a narrow clearing. An instant that decides lives, but not borders. And this is what confuses historians. Because the impact existed, in each isolated account, in each missed mention in the personal diaries, the rifle appears as a ghost. Rapid, brutal, definitive. The Japanese who survived the failed infiltrations describe not the weapon itself, but the fear of sound. A single clack of action being triggered in the dark was enough to dismantle a tactic built on absolute silence. It was the sound that exposed the fragility of a doctrine based on spirit, not technology. In the few post-war interrogations that mention rifle encounters, soldiers do not speak of American superiority. They speak of surprise. The word appeals. Surprised by the existence of the weapon, surprised by the short and lethal range, surprised by the violent cadence of the slam fire, surprised that something seemingly rudimentary could nullify years of spiritual training. But at the same time, on the American side, the perception was different. The soldier saw the rifle as a tool, not a symbol. It was useful in ambushes, excellent at night, perfect for dense forest, but limited, heavy, and restricted. He did not treat her as a protagonist but as an accessory, and this asymmetry of perceptions created another peculiar effect. The weapon marked the enemy more than the user himself. That is why when writing memoirs, American veterans spoke of the Garand with pride, of the bar with reverence, of the flamethrower with horror. The rifle did not appear, not because he was irrelevant, but because his performance was episodic, almost intimate, confined to the level of the isolated soldier. It did not move battalions. He moved only seconds. And yet, these seconds could decide entire ambushes. If told by the Japanese survivors, the story of the shotgun would be one of terror and bewilderment. If told by Americans, it would be one of functionality and practicality. If counted by the planners, it would be statistically insignificant. And if told by cinema, it would be heroic, exaggerated, decisive, something it never was. This set of conflicting narratives has turned the rifle into an artifact that exists more in culture than doctrine, more in emotional memory than in military archives. And precisely for this reason, it occupies a place so difficult to define. A weapon remembered but not studied, feared but not prioritized, iconic but not strategic. The paradox is in its essence. It was created for extremely close combat. However, the Pacific War, despite the jungle, was defined by logistics, artillery, and aviation. It was designed for specific situations. However, he faced inadequate ammunition during most of the campaign. It had devastating power. However, it rarely altered the course of a battle. She was perfect for psychological shock. However, invisible to the officers who wrote reports. Thus is born the paradox of the well-aimed weapon. Too efficient to be ignored in the field. Too limited to be celebrated in history. Japan did not wait for it and was surprised. The United States did not depend on it and moved on. And the historical record was caught between these two worlds. But the real revelation is yet to come, because in understanding the marginal fate of this weapon, the larger question arises. If the shotgun didn't shape the war, who did? And what does this reveal about the very concept of military power in the 20th century? While the Imperial Japanese Army consolidated its quasi-ritual view of war, believing that combat would be decided by courage, blade, and spiritual discipline, the United States advanced a different philosophy. Nothing was sacred in doctrine. Everything was provisional. Everything could be revised. This difference, invisible from a distance, became fatal when placed in front of the unpredictable. The 12-gauge shotgun is just one example, small, almost lateral, of how Japan has failed to ignore what did not fit into its own assumptions. For its planners, a hunter's weapon could never be relevant in military campaigns. Therefore, it should not be studied. For Americans, if a gun worked, it would be used, refined, and distributed. Japanese doctrine began to crumble, just as the Pacific battlefields proved closer to American improvisation than to the samurai ideal. While Japan rejected technologies it deemed impure, or unhonorable, the U.S. embraced every tool available, including unlikely ones. And therein lies one of the hardest lessons in military history. War does not respect internal beliefs, only concrete results. Japan's inability to see the usefulness of armaments outside its cultural horizon echoed in other critical areas. Radar, for example, was treated as a scientific curiosity in Japanese military circles, while the United States turned it into the nervous system of the war in the Pacific. Logistics, seen by the Japanese as a secondary support, became among the Americans the very basic condition for operating. Mechanization, seen as unnecessary modern excess, was, for the United States, the way to multiply human strength by the dozens. Mass production, which Japan could not match, was treated by the United States not only as an advantage, but as a strategic weapon par excellence. Every ship, every runway, every advanced depot, every landing was proof of this contrast of visions. And when a doctrine of purity meets a doctrine of adaptation, the combat is already decided long before the first shot. The 12-gauge shotgun, although marginal in the American view, exposes this abyss. Japan did not develop countermeasures for it, not because it could not, but because it did not believe it was necessary. Its absence from the manuals is more than a technical error. It is a mirror of a military dogmatic where reality was only valid if it fit into the myth. And this myth defined that combat would be decided by the Japanese initiative, by the courage of the night attack, by the moral superiority of the imperial soldier. But the jungle, indifferent to theories, favored just the opposite. It favored improvisation, the unexpected sound, the short explosion, the weapon that did not ask for distance, only presence. The very idea that a shotgun, a weapon seen as a symbol of American rusticity, could break the back of Japanese doctrine was testimony to a deeper truth. Japanese doctrine had stopped in time. The contrast is even more evident when one examines the intellectual structure of the two forces. The U.S. accepted war as a dynamic phenomenon. Every new weapon, every logistical failure, every encounter in the jungle generated revision, adjustments, tactical updates. Japan, by contrast, pursued doctrinal purity with almost religious fervor. For his officers, victory would come from the intensity of the will, not the efficiency of the equipment. This logic was applied at all levels, from the insistence on the bayonet to the refusal to prioritize modern radios, to the slowness in replacing old weapons. And when a country goes to war on principles that do not speak to the real world, the outcome is predictable. War punishes rigidity. The shotgun is a symbol of this friction. It was not the weapon that would change the fate of the war, and it did not. But his presence in the field, however limited, exposed how Japanese doctrine had no room for improvisation, surprise, or adaptation. With each thwarted night attack, with each infiltration thwarted by the sound of an action being triggered in the dark, it became clear that Japan was fighting with techniques designed for another era. The doctrine of spirit overcomes machine worked only as long as the enemy agreed to fight under the conditions that this doctrine presupposed. But when the enemy brought unforeseen technologies, massive logistics, varied armaments, and flexible strategies, the spirit ceased to be an advantage and became a burden. This mistake was repeated on a larger scale throughout the conflict. When the United States began projecting power through aircraft carriers, Japan still believed in the classic naval duel. When the Americans organized continuous supply chains between California and the front, Japan was trying to sustain battles with ships that could barely cross submarine-infested oceans. When the U.S. introduced light and accurate mortars, Japan insisted on infantry advances against fortified positions. Each Japanese choice was more tied to a military ideal than to the reality of combat. And every American choice was tied more to pragmatism than to tradition. That is why the shotgun, even though it is a secondary weapon, has become an illustrative piece of this contrast. Its simple doctrinal shock revealed failures that in other areas, communication, transportation, supply, aviation, would be devastating. When a nation cannot predict even the usefulness of a hunting weapon, it can hardly predict the strength of an entire system based on continuous innovation, and this failure of imagination cost Japan more than battles. It took the ability to understand modern warfare before it was too late. In the end, this is the military lesson that crosses generations. Doctrines that ignore the improbable end up defeated by the unexpected. History shows that it is not the most powerful weapon that wins, It is the doctrine that recognizes the value of every tool, even the most humble. The 12-gauge rifle did not win the war, but the fact that Japan failed to anticipate it says a lot about why it lost. And that realization paves the way for the final question, because the next chapter reveals the moment when even the United States had to face the improbable within its own military machine. The story of the 12-gauge rifle in the Pacific is not, after all, just a narrative of armaments. It is a human story, a story of moral clash between two worlds that went to war believing in different truths. On the one hand, the Japanese tradition, shaped by decades of doctrine that exalted the honor of direct combat, the purity of the bayonet, silence as a virtue and courage as the main weapon. On the other, American pragmatism, which turned any object, a makeshift plane, a bulldozer, a flamethrower, or a hunter's rifle, into a tool of war, if it meant protecting lives and winning battles. In the midst of this ideological confrontation were young men who had learned to fear sounds that their generals never mentioned. For the Japanese infantry, hearing the clack of a bomb action being triggered in the darkness meant realizing, in an instant, that real war did not obey the principles they had been taught. There was no spiritual discipline that could nullify the brutal dispersion of buckshot. There was not enough courage to face a shot that covered entire areas of the jungle in fractions of a second. The rifle, in this sense, was more than an instrument. It was a mirror. It showed that tradition was no protection, that the past did not guarantee survival, that modern warfare punished any belief that ignored the physical reality of combat. For Americans, on the other hand, the gun carried another meaning, more intimate, more mundane. The soldier who wielded it knew that it would not change the course of the campaign. He knew that it would not destroy bunkers. It would not bring down planes. It would not advance over fortified hills. But he also knew that, on that patrol trail, at that exact moment, in that encounter 5 meters away, she could be the difference between returning home or disappearing into the woods. The rifle was, for many, the weapon of immediate survival, and this creates an emotional paradox. For the American, it symbolized protection. For the Japanese, disorientation. The death it caused did not come with warning, duel, or honor, and this absence of ritual deeply wounded a military culture that associated human value with the way one fought, not just the final result. Thus, when Japanese accounts mention encounters with shotguns, always in a fragmented, almost whispered way, what appears is not fear of the weapon itself, but of the rupture of meaning that it imposed. It was as if the war was telling you, what you believe in no longer controls anything here. And perhaps this is the most bitter part of this whole story. The 12-gauge shotgun didn't just kill soldiers. It killed certainties. Each shot carried more than lead. He carried a brutal lesson about adaptation, about humility in the face of the unexpected, about the fatal mistake of despising what one does not understand. And this lesson was not restricted to the Japanese. Years later, American veterans said little about the shotgun, not because it was irrelevant, but because the kind of death it caused was too personal, too close, too silent to become a comfortable memory. Many avoided mentioning it because it put them in front of the rawest part of war, the moment when a man shoots in the dark knowing that there is another man, equally young, equally frightened, a few meters away. In the end, the weapon becomes a symbol of a human encounter that neither side was prepared to face. The Japanese because they clung to a romantic view of war. Americans because they knew that the effectiveness of the shotgun came exactly from the collapse of this illusion. Ultimately, the 12-gauge rifle exposed a conflict far deeper than that of armies. It exposed the conflict between pride and adaptation, between tradition and reality, between the man who wants war to be one way and the war that insists on being another. This is the part of history that remains alive even when statistics are erased and files are lost. Because while weapons change, human vulnerability in the face of the unexpected remains. And it is this vulnerability, this moral truth that runs through uniforms and flags, that sets the stage for the final revelation. Because the real end of this story is not in the shotgun, but in what it revealed about an entire military culture about to collapse in the face of something much bigger than a shot in the jungle. At the conclusion of this journey across the Pacific, it becomes impossible to ignore the structural truth that runs through each episode analyzed. The Japanese defeat was not caused by the 12-gauge rifle, but by the brutal clash between an inflexible doctrine and a power that had transformed industry, logistics, and adaptation into strategic weapons. American superiority manifested itself not only in ships, cargoes, or airfields, but in one's own ability to see value in what the adversary despised. The rifle, an unlikely symbol of this contrast, exposed a reality that was present long before the first shot. Japan prepared for an idealized war, while the United States prepared for the possible war. And on the actual battlefield, where mud, jungle, humidity, and darkness dictated the rules, it was the second sight that prevailed. The American weapon, as simple as it is underestimated, only revealed the profound flaw of a doctrine that relied more on myth than on material, more on spirit than on supplies, more on faith than on continual adaptation. This story contains a universal lesson. Wars are not won by bravery alone, nor by military mysticism, nor by speeches about honor. Wars are decided by supply chains, by productive capacity, by transportation systems, by immense reserves of materials, and by a doctrine capable of absorbing the unexpected. The 12-gauge shotgun, although small within the American arsenal, shows precisely this. Even the least valued weapon can become decisive in a suitable environment, but only if it has behind it a structure capable of supporting it. In the Pacific, this structure existed only on one side. Therefore, the sound of the rifle echoed far beyond the clearings where it was fired, echoed as a metaphor for a changing world, in which rigid tradition ceased to be an advantage and became a burden. Japan lost not because it lacked courage, but because it lacked the ability to recognize that modern warfare was an industrial, logistical, and technological phenomenon, and every nation that ignores this reality ends up fighting against its own past. At the end of the conflict, a captured German officer summed up this irony with almost disconcerting clarity. "We were defeated by trucks." The sentence, short and devastating, describes not only Germany, but all the nations that believed that determination would suffice in the face of an organized power to sustain continuous effort. If you value this accurate reconstruction of history and recognize the importance of revisiting these unfiltered facts, support this work. Leave your like, subscribe to strengthen the research and the search for historical truth, and comment on what was the most shocking fact you discovered in this video. Activate the bell so you don't miss the next devastating historical fact that will be revealed here. And this continuity is essential, because each chapter of 20th century warfare connects to the next like links in a chain that still shapes the world today. The story of the shotgun is a reflection of a larger truth. Doctrines break, industries decide, and the jungle, physical or symbolic, favors those who know how to adapt. And if there's one thing this narrative makes clear, it's that triumph on the battlefield belongs to those who understand that flexibility is as vital as strength. Don't go away yet. Listen to the next true story that will appear on the screen. Always remember, logistics determines strategy. Watch the next video here on the channel with another incredible story that continues to unravel the backstage of military power and the decisions that change the course of humanity. Because deep down, every war carries with it one last lesson. No army, no matter how disciplined, courageous, or traditional, can resist the accumulation of small structural flaws. Japan believed it could make up for the absence of industry with fervor, believed it could stand up to a continental power with fragile supply lines. He believed that the spirit could fill gaps left by steel, gunpowder, and fuel. But history has shown that there is no belief that can replace capacity. The shotgun, in all its simplicity, showed that even the despised detail can become a symbol of an announced defeat. And it is impossible to ignore the irony that arises when an entire nation prepares to face tanks, ships, and planes, but ends up surprised by the short rumble of a weapon it has never studied. That boom, repeated on Guadalcanal, Bougainville, Palaleu, and Okinawa, became a kind of signature of a world that was changing too quickly for those who insisted on remaining still. Each shot represented not only American strength, but the Japanese inability to comprehend what was really shaping the war. And this inability would resonate for decades to come in global military thought, reminding us that no doctrine survives intact at first contact with reality. In the end, every Pacific engagement reinforced this point, and every Japanese defeat cemented the same conclusion. A country that does not adapt loses not to the enemy but to itself, and by the time that truth finally emerged, it was too late to correct course. Therefore, when we revisit the trajectory of the shotgun, we do not study just one weapon. We study a mentality, a structure, a worldview, and we understand that, ultimately, wars are fought by men, but won by systems. This understanding ends the narrative, but opens space to reflect on the present. In a century marked by accelerated innovation, any military force that ignores improvised tools, emerging technologies, or unconventional forms of power essentially repeats Japan's mistake. The modern battlefield is dominated by drones, communication networks, electronic intelligence, and global supply chains, but also by simple solutions capable of turning a confrontation around. The 12-gauge shotgun no longer belongs at the center of operations, but its meaning remains. Never underestimate the instrument that seems too small to matter. Many wars begin with rigid certainties and end with painful lessons. And the biggest lesson is this: strategic pride always takes its toll. And each of these lessons echoes through the ages, reminding you that constant adaptation is the true essence of victory always.